Good morning, everyone. Today is Easter Sunday. So in honor of that, I would like to share with you a pilgrimage I took in 2011. I visited Rome. I stayed in a convent that was only French speaking, and the arrangements were made by Swami Brahmaprana from Bellarmine. And that was a joy to also visit the catacombs. My hostess was a Roman. She grew up in Rome. So she took me to many places that many tourists never see. And that was a great joy. And the atmosphere in Rome was tremendous because of the spiritual heritage that it received. And then on to Assisi. And Assisi was an unbelievable experience. Many, I've shared with you before, many of the monks and nuns of our order have visited there because of the spiritual vibration that's as tangible as what you will find in Varanasi. After that, I went to Florence, and that, is rich in art, but the atmosphere, it felt like a thud. The atmosphere was completely secular. And it was, if you ever do that pilgrimage, go to Florence first, and then Rome, and then Assisi. So let's begin. Find my way here. Saint Francis of Assisi, a revolutionary Rishi. Francis beheld a vast hall hung with armor, bearing the crucifix as its coat of arms. "To whom does this belong?" he asked. "These are for you and your warriors," a voice replied. When Francis awoke, he thought, "What a good omen. This morning I am to leave Assisi and join the Pope's army. Surely now I will have success as a soldier of fortune." But when Francis set out for battle the next morning, he reached only Spoleto before he was attacked with fever. Again the voice was heard. "Francis, who can do more for you, a lord or his servant, a rich man or a beggar?" "Surely a lord or a rich man," Francis replied. "Then why are you abandoning the Lord to devote yourself to a servant?" the voice replied. "Why are you choosing a beggar instead of God, who has infinite riches?" "Lord, what would you have me do?" Francis asked in bewilderment. "Return to Assisi, and you will be told what to do. You must interpret your vision differently. The arms and palace you saw are meant for another kind of knight, and your principality will be another order." Francis awoke in joyous wonder. Had the Lord really spoken to his servant? What could this mean? He turned homeward to Assisi. In 1181, Francis was born to Pica and Pietro di Bernardone, a wealthy cloth merchant in Assisi, a village 90 miles north of Rome in the rolling hills of Umbria. Francis quickly became leader of the town youth, as he much preferred to spend money on food and drink for himself and his friends and dress in fine clothes than to help his father in his merchant trade. However, Francis's extravagances extended to the poor as well, imbued as he was with a medieval faith in Christ's teaching. "Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me." One day, when he was selling cloth in his father's shop, A beggar approached him for alms, por amor de Dio, for the love of God. But Francis was too busy to bother, so the beggar left empty-handed. Later, Francis was filled with remorse. If that beggar had asked for alms in the name of some great prince, I would have given him what he desired. How much more should I have given when he asked in the name of the King of Kings and Lord of all? Francis then vowed to never again refuse anyone who begged in the name of God. At 23 years of age, Francis fell seriously ill, a convalescence that lasted several months and evoked a deep change within him. His life seemed empty, bereft of meaning, and Francis lost all fervor for his life of merriment and frivolity. Though his body eventually regained its former health, something had shifted in Francis's heart. Though he didn't understand at the time, the Lord was preparing his heart as the pure abode for his Son. For as long as the heart is full of created things, one commentator beautifully expressed, there is no room for the holy child of the Creator, who loves nothing so much as poverty of spirit, which is emptiness of things, which is purity. Without understanding the grace of God, Francis tried to revive his former joie de vivre by taking up a life of chivalric honor. His opportunity came when a war broke out between the Germans and the Pope over the throne of the emperor, and throngs of young Italians, including young Francis, bore arms under the Pope to defeat the foreign invaders. It was at this time that Francis had the dream of the palace filled with armor and heard the voice of God commanding him to return to Assisi. Once home, a battle arose in Francis's heart. At times he followed the momentum of his old habits and caroused with his friends, but at other times he felt called to go into solitude and listen for the voice of God. Then one summer evening in 1205, when he and his friends were singing merrily as they wended their way through the streets of Assisi, Francis fell back, overcome by a deep spiritual mood. His heart was touched with such heavenly sweetness that he could neither speak nor move, a mood in the Hindu tradition known as Madhava Bhava, bestowed by the Lord in his aspect as the Sweet One. Francis lost all external consciousness. Later, he disclosed that if at that moment he had been cut to pieces, he would have been completely devoid of any body consciousness. When his companions suddenly noticed that Francis was missing, they turned back and found him completely transformed. "Why didn't you follow us?" they teased. "Were you thinking of getting married?" "Yes, I am about to take a wife of surpassing fairness," he replied, referring to none other than Lady Poverty. But while his friends laughed, Francis remained subdued. From that moment on, Francis began to lavish his generosity on the poor. He sought out any number of beggars and fed them sumptuously. And when approached on the street, Francis would offer his shirt or any other article of clothing he could give to those in need. But this was not enough. One day, Francis set out on pilgrimage to Rome, where he could fulfill his heart's passion anonymously, away from the public gaze of those who knew him. There, at the entrance of St. Peter's Basilica, he saw beggars asking for alms. And he quietly borrowed the clothes of one so he could join them. Francis begged in French, the language of poetry, the language he always used when his heart surpassed any joy that could find expression in Italian. Here in Rome and in rags, Francis tasted real spiritual poverty, willfully born for the love of God. After returning to Assisi, Francis received the answer to his prayers, definite instructions that he could follow. The Lord commanded, "O Francis, if you want to know my will, you must hate and despise all that which hitherto your body has loved and desired to possess. Once you begin to do this, all that formerly seemed sweet and pleasant to you will become bitter and unbearable. And instead, the things that formerly made you shudder will bring you great sweetness and content." Francis pondered these words. Then one day, as he was riding near Assisi, he met a leper. He had always felt an overpowering horror at the sight of these sufferers. But with great fortitude, he managed to conquer his aversion, dismount, give the leper a coin, and kissed his hand. The leper then gave him the kiss of peace, after which Francis remounted his horse and rode away with an unknown sweetness welling in his heart. Such was the power of fulfilling Christ's command that the next day Francis was inspired to take a large sum of money to the nearby leper hospital. Gathering all the inmates together, he gave them alms, kissing each of their hands. Formerly, he couldn't have borne to look at their putrefying and disfigured bodies. But when he left them on that day, what had been so repugnant to him before had turned into a spiritual conquest of attachment and aversion, culminating in the attainment of even-mindedness. This was the same sublime mood of equanimity that Sri Ramakrishna had attained after undergoing such tantric practices as cleaning latrines with his hair and eating the defiled food left by jackals and dogs. In fact, it is Sri Ramakrishna's spiritual practices and resulting bhavas or spiritual moods that can give us the context and authority to accept, assimilate, and deepen our understanding of such a God-intoxicated revolutionary Rishi as Saint Francis. Not long after this incident with the lepers, Francis was one day praying before an ancient crucifix in a small wayside chapel of Sant Damiano below the town of Assisi. "O great and glorious God," he entreated, "enlighten the darkness of my mind. Grant me enduring faith, firm hope, and perfect charity. Help me to embrace the depths of your love, that in all ways I may act by thy light and in accordance with thy holy will." All past struggles became consecrated into a prayer of such yearning and intensity that Christ heard and responded as a sweet whisper emanating from Francis's heart. "Go, Francis, and repair my church, which as you see is falling into ruin." The humble and simple-hearted Francis thought that Christ meant the little chapel of San Damiano, which was in ruins. He didn't realize that Christ was commanding him to repair the Catholic Church, the mystical body of Christ, whose followers had strayed from their original spirit of renunciation, poverty, prayer, and mystic communion. So Francis went to his father's merchant shop, bundled together a load of expensive drapery on his horse, and at a nearby marketplace sold both horse and fabric to pay for the necessary restoration of San Damiano. When Pietro di Bernardino heard of his son's conduct, he became so enraged that Francis was forced to hide for a month in a cave near San Damiano in order to avoid his father's wrath. When Francis finally emerged, emaciated and in tatters, and entered Assisi, the villagers not only pelted him with mud and stones, but mocked him as a madman. But Francis's heart was filled with such joy and radiant light that he was completely oblivious to the commotion around him. But hearing the noise, Pietro ran out into the street to find his son heckled by a mob. Angered and humiliated, he beat Francis then and there and locked him in a dark cellar. Later, freed by his mother, Francis fled to San Damiano, where he found shelter until summoned before the Bishop of Assisi by his father to retrieve whatever money he still had and publicly strip him of his inheritance. However, the bishop knew and admired Francis's sincerity and thus asked him to return whatever money he had in order that he may serve God single-mindedly without any further interference from his father. Overjoyed by this request, Francis stripped himself naked and presented his clothes to his father. Hitherto, I have called you my father on earth. Henceforth, I desire to say only our Father who art in heaven. This took place in 1206. All present, except Pietro, wept to see this young man's sincerity, guilelessness, and uncompromising renunciation. Now free to follow Christ in poverty and joy, Francis set forth from Assisi, possessing nothing but a simple robe on his back. With the radiance of Christ in his heart, he sang in French the glory of God. From those who gathered round him, he would beg stones and mortar to carry on his back to San Damiano, where he himself undertook the masonry work to repair the chapel. Francis also begged his food in this way. Though his first alms were such a hodgepodge of food, scraps that the sight of them made him nauseous, Francis determined to overcome his aversion, took his first bite, and lo, the food tasted like nectar, and at the same time, his heart became suffused with joy. One morning in February 1208, while attending the Mass in the chapel of Portuncolo, yet another chapel he had restored, Francis heard a passage from the Gospel of Matthew that deeply moved him. And as ye go, preach saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out devils. Freely ye have received, freely give. Provide neither gold, nor silver, nor brass in your purses, nor script for your journey, neither two coats, neither shoes, nor yet staves, for the workman is worthy of his meat. Francis recognized this passage as the foundation of his spiritual life, and from that day onward, he never again wore shoes, carried a staff, nor kept a second garment. He wore only a gray peasant's tunic of undyed wool, tied at the waist with a knotted robe. When wandering, he would greet passersby with, "The Lord give thee peace." And if he saw a crowd, he would approach, stand barefoot in its midst, and pray. The words he spoke mesmerized and captivated the hearts of those who heard them, empowered as they were by his own spiritual practices and attainments. Thus, Francis's gradual conversion shows us the path from an ordinary man to a man of God, from self-indulgent worldliness to a God-intoxicated selflessness. Villagers no longer laughed when they saw Francis, for he radiated an unspeakable purity and devotion, and soon began to attract followers. The first was Bernard of Quintabille, who had watched how Francis had transformed himself from a light-hearted, adventure-seeking youth to a one-pointed, fearless knight of Christ. However, before Bernard could join Francis, he resolved first to put him to a test. Thus he invited him to his house to spend the night. Francis accepted, and when he arrived, he went straight to his bed, feigning fatigue and then sleep. But when Bernard also retired, he kept a watchful eye. And to his astonishment, he observed how Francis, when he finally heard snoring coming from his bed, arose to pray tearfully and unceasingly throughout the night, "My God and my all." Sri Ramakrishna's disciples also observed how the master slept only an hour at night, the rest of his time spent in meditation and communion with the Divine Mother. Once at Dakshineshwar, the master's nephew Hridoy became so anxious that Ramakrishna was spending his nights in the Panchavati that he decided to investigate his behavior. Silently one night he followed the master into the jungle and there saw from a distance that the master had discarded his clothes and sacred thread and was immersed in meditation. When Ramakrishna slowly regained consciousness, Hridoy boldly stepped before him and demanded, "What is this? Why are you sitting naked?" "What do you know?" Ramakrishna replied. "One should meditate by becoming free from all ties, the 8 fetters of hatred, shame, family status, good conduct, fear, fame, pride of class, and ego." After Bernard and another man named Peter Catani joined Francis, he took them both into the church of San Nicolo, prayed for guidance, and then in honor of the Holy Trinity, opened the New Testament 3 times to find Christ's teachings to his disciples. "If thou wilt be perfect, go and sell that thou hast and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven." Matthew 19:21. "Take nothing for your journey." Luke 9:3. "And thirdly, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." Matthew 16:24. In time, Bernard attained such spiritual greatness that he would go into the mountains and remain absorbed in meditation for 20 or 30 days at a stretch. And Francis so respected Peter's spiritual wisdom that in 3 years, he made him the first minister general of the Franciscan order. The friars' joy knew no bounds, united as they were in Christ's love and holy poverty. They cared for each other as a mother cares for her children, taking turns to watch over those who went into solitude to pray, periodically supplying food and blankets to them when needed. Francis wrote in his rule, "Those who wish to live religiously in hermitages should be 3 brothers or 4 at the most. 2 of these should be mothers, and they should have 2 sons, or at least 1. The 2 who are mothers should follow the life of Martha, service, while the 2 sons should follow the life of Mary, contemplation. And they may have an enclosure in which each one may have his small cell, in which he may pray and sleep." The friars lived not only in the mountains of Assisi, but stayed together in huts surrounding the Portuncola, a small chapel now enshrined in the Basilica of Santa Maria degli Angeli on the plains beneath the town of Assisi. When the friars had grown in number, they began to go out in twos throughout the Italian countryside to inspire villagers to devote themselves to God. Francis himself traveled from village to village, joyously singing in French the Lord's praises. One day during these wandering days, Francis sought solitude in an underground mountain cave, and there he grieved openly, wept at the wasted years of his youth, and begged God's forgiveness in order to be made worthy of his grace. Suddenly, Francis went into ecstasy, bathed in bliss and light. God assured him that his many sins were forgiven down to the last farthing. From then onward, Francis was freed from his past karmas and preached without hesitation or guilt. Saint Francis had become a Jivan Mukta, a rare soul who is free while living. Just as Ramakrishna practiced renunciation of money by holding in his hands coins and lumps of clay, as he repeated, "Rupee is clay and clay is rupee," and then throwing them both into the Ganges. So also Francis showed his monks how to impress the mind with the knowledge that money has no value to a spiritual aspirant who strives for God alone. The friars lived in joy because they had renounced so much and would often tear off pieces of their own garments in order to offer alms to the poor. One day, a devotee left money before the crucifix in the Portuncola chapel, and spotting it, one of the friars fastidiously picked it up and placed it on a windowsill. When Francis learned how the monk had touched this money, he ordered him to take it in his mouth, carry it outside the chapel, and drop it on the nearest dung heap. In these ways, Francis trained his monks to live a pure life, free from the slightest taint of lust and greed, and dedicated to God alone. By the spring of 1208, the community of friars had grown to 12. So Francis decided to take them to Rome to have their rule approved by Pope Innocent III. But before their arrival, the Pope had a prophetic dream in which he was standing in the Lateran Palace, viewing with dread the great basilica of St. John Lateran collapsing in ruin. Just as it was about to fall, a small man, barefoot and dressed in the clothes of a peasant, stepped forward and set his shoulder to the church wall. Gradually and single-handedly, this simple man moved the entire church edifice to an upright position. No sooner had Francis and his friars appeared before the Pope than the pontiff recognized this barefoot, plain-looking man standing before him as the one in his dream who had come forth to support the church edifice. He realized that Francis would save the Christian church from moral decay by the sheer power of his spirituality. Thus, Pope Innocent III wholeheartedly blessed Francis's rule of life and gave him the authority to preach. Shortly thereafter, the friars were tonsured and called themselves the Order of the Friars Minor. Soon they built by the side of the portuncula huts made of branches, straw, and mud, and thatched with leaves. For the friars, the earth was their table, straw their beds, and a hedge for their monastery walls. Francis's life and message soon drew nobles and commoners alike. Though he himself was the epitome of humility, his words carried uncompromising authority and power. Among those he inspired was Clare, a young noble maiden of Assisi. It was in the austere Romanesque cathedral of San Rufino that St. Francis delivered his inspired sermons to a spellbound Clare. Centuries later, when I came to Assisi and crossed the church threshold from the street, I knew that I had entered another world, tangible, powerful, otherworldly, with its beautiful gold-framed paintings, inviting intimacy of an altar that had witnessed real communion with God, and well-worn solid wood pews that had seen the spiritual bloom of Assisi residents who had come into contact with the unparalleled Leela of St. Francis and St. Clare. Every object within the cathedral, not to speak of the very air I breathed, the interior space of the cathedral itself seemed to vibrate with consciousness. No wonder Clare, when she first heard St. Francis preach in the Cathedral of Assisi, became transformed into a follower. Resisting her parents' attempts to have her married, she ran away from home to a convent Francis had founded, later called the Poor Clares, and there she professed her vows. St. Francis's mission was growing. About this time, lay devotees also were inspired to join a third order of Franciscans to live in the world, but not of it. Francis encouraged them to periodically withdraw from family life, go into solitude, and live a period of intense prayer. Also, Franciscan missionaries went throughout Italy, into Germany, Hungary, France, Spain, and England. Francis himself traveled to Spain and the Holy Land. But periodically, Francis yearned to withdraw from the world and live a life solely devoted to prayer. As Thomas of Celano, his biographer and contemporary, explained, by now Francis's whole being was changed into prayer. He lived the life of the Spirit. In this connection, after Naran, the future Vivekananda, realized God, both with form and without form, he disclosed to his master that above all, he wanted to live absorbed in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, returning to normal consciousness after 3 or 4 days just to eat in order to survive. Brahmaprana was displeased. Shame on you, he rebuked Naran. There is a much higher state than that. All that exists art thou. Vivekananda was born for the good of mankind, not just to taste the bliss of God for himself, but to share it with others. So also was Francis's spiritual destiny. Once when Francis was torn between these two opposing tendencies, He asked St. Clare, Brother Sylvester, and another sister to pray on his behalf for guidance in this regard. The response came to them. God has not called him for his own sake, but also to save others. And when Francis heard this, he became filled with spiritual power and announced to two of his companions, brothers Maceo and Angelo, let us go in the name of the Lord. As they walked, Francis saw ahead on the roadside a multitude of birds gathered. He asked his companions to wait as he approached them and began to preach, addressing them as sisters and walking in their midst. The birds completely devoid of fear as his cowl brushed against their bodies. It is said that when Francis's sermon ended, they fluttered their wings, bowed their heads in reverence, and flew into the air with a joyous sound. Sri Ramakrishna also reached a stage during his tantric sadhana when he heard the Anahata Dhvani, the Pranava Om, and at that time he was able to understand the voices of beasts, birds, and other creatures, one of the many spiritual powers of that spiritual being known as an avatar. To the friars, Francis emphasized cheerfulness as a sign of spiritual progress, forbade harsh ascetic practices that tortured the body, and ordered that no one should show a sad and gloomy face to others in the monastic community. Rather, he counseled, if you have sinned, go to your cell, examine yourself, and weep over your sin before God. But when you return to your brothers, put aside your sadness and be cheerful like the others. In this way, he trained his friars to be messengers of joy for the whole world. One pillar of Francis's joy was his love for religious poverty. Indeed, he disclosed that it was not only blessed to give alms, but blessed to receive them as well. Just as he called begged food angel's bread, so also alms collected by Hindu sannyasins is considered consecrated food called madhukari, or honey collected by bees. The other pillar of Francis's joy was his spirituality, fed by Lord Jesus's love and message. Francis shunned idle gossip and insisted on hearing only spiritual conversation, a state which comes to highly advanced aspirants whose spiritual current has risen to the Vishuddha or throat chakra. As Sri Ramakrishna used to say, God is present where people talk about him. And God-intoxicated souls have the sensitivity to feel God consciousness kindled at these times. In ecstasy, Francis would sometimes dance, sing the Lord's praises, become enraptured by his beloved sweetness, or laugh in joy at the Lord's Leela. Once Sri Ramakrishna became pained at the sight of a wounded butterfly, but the next moment he laughed in ecstasy. "O Rama," he said, "you have created your own distress." Great souls such as Saint Francis had renounced the greatest of all burdens, the ego, and so the mind could soar to great spiritual heights. As Francis advanced in his sadhana, his love for nature swelled and transformed itself into the spiritual perception of a supreme divine presence within the cosmos, within everything animate or inanimate, born from God the Father. Francis expressed this experience of unity and diversity by the names he gave forms of nature in the world: Brother Sun, Sister Moon, Brother Fire, Sister Ashes, Brother Stone, Sister Planet. Furthermore, Francis conversed with these brothers and sisters because to him they were pulsating with consciousness. As one senior Swami of the Ramakrishna order expressed, in his vision, all created things participated in the being of God. Only such mystic knowledge could account for the incandescent love which he possessed for all beings. Due to a heightened sensitivity resulting from this awareness, he told the friar who cut the wood that he must never cut down the whole tree, but should spare some branches that the tree might live. If Francis found an earthworm on the road, he would gently put it on the side so that no one might crush it. Even when he walked over rocks, he would often be seen to step reverently and carefully. Such insight is born of the non-dual experience. Once, when a man crossed the field, the master felt an unbearable pain. Later, he told his disciples, I felt as though someone had trampled on my chest. Francis also revered the spoken and written word, for to him all words symbolize divine revelation. In fact, any writings he found on the roadside, he would gather and lay aside in reverence. Once, when Francis was told that the writings he had rescued in this way were from a heathen author, he replied that it didn't matter, since words, whether heathen or non-heathen, all came from the wisdom of God. We find this metaphysical principle expressed in the tantric doctrine of the Logos, or Svotabhada, that the universe and every object within the universe has a Logos, or Svotabhada. The idea or Logos of each form first arises before the object it denotes materializes. In the Tantrika science of the mantra, the Logos, or sacred seed word, which denotes a particular form of God, is considered the same as the aspect of God it represents. And when rightly pronounced, it generates that form of God. Francis was a mystic whose fierce yearning for God generated an interior life rich in profound spiritual experiences and visions. In 1216, he had a telling vision of Christ at the Portuncula. The church was suddenly filled with a brilliant light, and Francis saw above the altar Christ, clothed in light, and on his right side, Mother Mary, surrounded by a multitude of angels. Francis, with face on the ground, adored the Lord in silence. The vision then asked what he desired for the salvation of souls, and Francis immediately responded, Holiest Father, even though I'm a poor sinner, I pray that all who come to this church, having repented for their sins and confessed them, may receive a bountiful and generous pardon with the full remission of all faults. The Lord answered, Your request is great, Brother Francis, but of greater things are you worthy, and greater things you will receive. I therefore grant you your prayer, but only on condition that you ask my vicar on earth. Saint Francis immediately went to Rome, and Pope Honorius III gave his approval by saying, For how many years would you like this indulgence? Francis replied, I do not ask for years, but for souls. Then, as Francis left, the Pope asked, do you not even want a document? Your word is enough for me, Francis replied. If this indulgence is from God, he will know how to manifest it. The paper is the holiest Virgin Mary. Christ is the notary, and the angels the witness. As the Franciscan order swelled to hundreds of friars, some of whom barely knew St. Francis, the bond of mutual love that had once held the community together began to wane. In place of brotherly love, rules had to be established to maintain unity and harmony. And so with the years, the order became more formalized. A more formalized organization. Francis had always taught by example. To rule by law went against his very grain. And so in 1220, he resigned as head of the order. However, until his death, all the friars considered him their de facto leader and inspiration. In the summer of 1224, Francis went into solitude on Mount Alverna to celebrate the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin and fast for 40 days to prepare for the feast of St. Michael. He was concerned about the future of his order, as it was straying from the high ideals of poverty, simplicity, and evangelical joy. So, as was his habit, when he yearned for spiritual direction, he asked one of his companions to open the Bible 3 times in order to behold the Lord's words and will. Each time, the Bible was opened to Christ's passion. Thus, Francis surrendered himself to God's will in imitation of Christ's last days on earth. The next night, he beheld an angel at his bedside with violin and bow in hand. Francis, the angel said, I will play for thee as we play before the throne of God in heaven. Then the angel drew the bow across the strings just once, and Francis experienced such divine sweetness and joy that he transcended all body consciousness. And his sorrow vanished. The next morning, Francis disclosed, if the angel had drawn the bow across the strings again, my joy would have been uncontrollable, and my soul would have left the body. Soon afterwards, Francis withdrew again to Mount Alverna, so wrapped in the contemplation of God that he would cease to speak for an entire day. One moonlit night, Brother Leo came upon Francis lying with arms outstretched in the sign of the cross, praying, O my dearest Lord and God, what art thou, and what indeed am I, thy little worthless worm of a servant? Suddenly Leo made a noise and disturbed Francis's reverie. Why have you reached me out? Francis rebuked him. You must never do so again. But when Leo asked the meaning of his prayer, Francis disclosed. In that prayer which you heard, 2 lights were manifested to me. One light in which I knew the Creator, and one in which I knew myself. When I said, what art thou, my Lord and God, and what am I? Then I was in the light of contemplation, in which I saw the infinite depth of the divine Godhead and my own wretched abyss of nothingness. Similarly, once Sri Ramakrishna explained to Narayan and others, there are 2 persons in this, meaning himself. One is the Divine Mother, and the other is her devotee. It is the devotee who is now ill. Do you understand? At last, on September 14, came the feast of the exaltation of the cross. Ever since the crucifix at San Damiano had become living to Francis, it had become a special object of his devotion. Before sunrise on the feast day, absorbed in the mystery of the cross, Francis prayed for two things. First, that he may, as far as possible, feel in his body and soul the suffering which Jesus sustained on the cross. And second, to receive in his own heart the boundless charity which inflamed Christ and enabled him to so willingly endure such suffering. In the little flowers of St. Francis, we read what had transpired. St. Francis began to contemplate with intense devotion the passion of Christ and his infinite charity. And the fervor of his devotion increased so much within him that he utterly transformed himself into Jesus through love and compassion. Suddenly from the heavens descended a seraph with 6 resplendent and flaming wings, bearing the likeness of the crucified Christ. Francis was transported by joy, wonder, and compassion, and lost all outer consciousness. Brother Leo, who was with St. Francis when he received the stigmata, left a clear account. The saint's right side was described as bearing an open wound, which looked as if made by a lance, while through the hands and feet were black nails of flesh, the points of which were bent backward. This was the ultimate seal of Francis's Christification, bestowed by Christ himself. In his body, he bore the stigmata, and in his heart, Christ's boundless compassion for all. Though Francis wanted to keep secret the special grace, he could not. Blood oozed from his wounds, and the nail-like formations protruded from his feet, so that he could hardly walk. For the rest of his life, he bore these marks of the imitation of Christ and kept them washed and bandaged. On September 30th, Francis bid adieu to his brothers and descended Mount Alverna with Brother Leo. On his way to the Portuncola, crowds gathered with olive branches and cried, "Here comes the saint," and rushed forward just to touch him. Francis was beyond such praise and was nearing his end. In 1225, he almost went blind from an eye disease, and so the doctors tried to operate and failed. According to the practice of the times, they decided to apply red-hot irons to both his temples. When Francis saw the irons, he entreated, "Brother Fire, I have always been good to you, and always will be so for love of him who has created you. Now show yourself gentle and courteous to me, and do not burn me more than I can bear." As the physician applied the irons, the brothers fled. But later St. Francis disclosed, "Why did you run? In truth, I felt no pain whatsoever, not even the heat of the fire." Such was Francis's yogic power to completely withdraw his mind from the body he called Brother Ass. Shortly thereafter, in September 1225, as his physical condition worsened, Francis paid his last visit to St. Clare at Sant Damiano. In his hut of reeds in the garden there, he composed the Canticle of the Sun, his vision of the divine presence pervading all. But in August 1226, feeling the hand of death upon him, he requested to be transported to Assisi. There in the bishop's residence, he asked the physician how long he would live. "Until the end of September or the beginning of October," was the reply. Francis joyously stretched his arms upward and cried, "Then welcome, Sister Death." Every day, hundreds and thousands gathered outside the bishop's residence to pay their respects to the dying saint, sometimes awestruck to hear from his window songs of joy. Finally, in September 1226, he insisted that he be taken to his beloved Portuncola, where he might breathe his last. When reaching the lepers' hospital, he asked to be set down, facing Assisi. Assisted by the friars, Francis was able to sit up. And he gazed for a long time on this town, which held so many sacred memories. At last, he lifted his hand and made the sign of the cross over the town, saying, "Blessed be thou of the Lord, for he has chosen thee to be a home and an abode for all those who in truth will glorify him and give honor to his name." The friars then carried Francis on to the Portuncola. On October 1st, Francis called all the brothers to his bedside and blessed each one. He turned to Bernard and placed his hand on his head in special blessing, asked all in the order to honor Bernard, as if he were myself, for he was the first who came to me and gave his goods to the poor. With a heart overflowing with love, he blessed all brethren in the order and those who were yet to come. I bless them as much as I can, and more than I can. On the evening of October 3rd, Francis asked that his habit be removed. And he lay naked on the bare ground. After a while, he asked to have read to him the Passion according to Saint John. And then in faltering voice, he chanted the Psalm 141. At the concluding verse, "Bring my soul out of prison," Francis entered Mahasamadhi. And so, dear friends, this is the culmination of St. Francis's life. And I strongly recommend that you go there. You will be overwhelmed with joy.